Imagine dedicating a decade of your life to a single story, investing hours in lore, in character theories, shared nostalgia, only for the final chapter to feel less like a powerful, earned conclusion.
And more like a rushed, over-explained birthday present given reluctantly by an estranged relative.
That is the perfect way to put it. That sentiment, that feeling of deep, almost personal disappointment, it just perfectly encapsulates the overwhelming reaction to the finale of one of the biggest streaming hits of the last decade.
And we're not just summarizing angry tweets today. What we're doing here is a deep forensic analysis of the specific narrative and, maybe more importantly, the meta-creative decisions that turned a dedicated global fan base against their beloved show.
That's our mission. We are diving into a torrent of critiques covering everything from fundamental plot mechanics and character integrity to really the very philosophy of modern television production.
Right. We're looking at the choices that led thousands of viewers to feel genuinely disrespected.
Disrespected is the right word.
So our core question, and this comes directly from the sources we've analyzed, is this. How did a series that launched with compelling mystery, with grounded characters, and just masterful pacing?
Yeah, that early pacing was incredible.
How did it finish with an anticlimactic battle, a slew of massive plot holes and core dramatic moments that, and this is a wild claim, many critics argue were literally longer than the final fight itself?
To answer that, we have to start at the top. We need to unpack the underlying production constraints that shaped, and I think you'd agree, ultimately undermined the entire narrative.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's jump right in with what many critics point to as the root cause. It's this fascinating and honestly a little alarming creative constraint. It's an idea they're calling the second screen syndrome.
Second screen syndrome. Yeah, it's a metacritical takeaway that defines a particular mandate in a lot of modern TV writing. It's all based on this pretty cynical assumption.
That the audience isn't really watching.
Exactly. That the modern audience is perpetually distracted. They aren't sitting quietly, giving 100% of their attention to the TV. They are, doom scrolling, texting, cooking, multitasking while the show's on in the background.
And if that's your creative baseline, if you assume nobody's really paying attention, what does that force you as a writer to do? It must change the fundamental structure of how you tell a story, doesn't it?
It changes everything.
If you think the viewer might look away for 45 seconds to check Instagram, you suddenly feel this pressure to make the storyline so utterly redundant that they can look back up and instantly know exactly what's going on.
Precisely. This mandate forces the insertion of heavy, often unnecessary exposition and just repetitive dialogue. It's a fail-safe mechanism designed to minimize confusion for the multitasker.
But what about the people who are engaged, the ones who are watching on a big screen, analyzing every detail?
For that viewer, this approach completely destroys immersion. It's insulting.
So you have two different viewing experiences at war with each other. The person paying attention, who's followed the lore for years, is constantly being treated like they just walked into the room.
And the consequence, as we saw over and over in the sources, is this profound narrative drag. Viewers who were paying attention felt insulted because characters would incessantly explain things that were already visually obvious.
Or they'd verbalize emotions that should have been conveyed subtly through, just acting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Performance, cinematography. Instead, you get dialogue that spells everything out.
One of the most severe critiques we found, and this one really stuck with me, they compared the later season's dialogue to watching Dora the Explorer.
Wow.
Yeah, because everything from plot twists to a character's inner feelings had to be explicitly spelled out, often multiple times. That's a devastating criticism for a complex adult drama.
It really is. It speaks to a deep flaw in the show don't tell rule of storytelling. When you have talented actors forced to deliver pages of dialogue just explaining what they're feeling like, I am worried about my friend, or I am conflicted about our future, it becomes jarringly inauthentic.
The assumption is that the audience's brain just needs to be fed these constant, easily digestible information pellets. It's a total lack of respect for the viewer's investment.
Well, let me just play devil's advocate for a second. Sure. Isn't inserting clarity better than confusing the audience? I mean, with a long-running show that has complex lore, sometimes you need exposition to bridge a time gap or explain something new.
That's a fair point. So is the issue the exposition itself, or is it just really badly written exposition?
That's the critical distinction. Well-written exposition is subtle. It's integrated into natural conversation.
Yeah.
The critique here is that it became a mandatory lecture that actively paused the plot.
Right.
The sources specifically call out certain characters for this. Robin's scenes, for example, are repeatedly cited for these long, drawn-out explanations that break all the tension and immersion.
And it wasn't just plot mechanics, it seeped into the emotional dialogue, too, turning what should have been intimate moments into absolute pacing killers.
Yes, think about those scenes. You have Jonathan and Nancy debating their future, or Mike and Will having that very scrutinized conversation in the van.
And it's all happening right before they're supposed to be running toward a world-ending conflict.
Exactly. When the world is minutes from collapse, and a character takes 6 or 7 minutes to deliver an emotional monologue about their deepest feelings, it just pulls you right out of the suspense. Feels deliberately inserted for the distracted viewer.
And all this second screen syndrome, it extends beyond just the dialogue. Sources suggest it actually impacted the visual aesthetics of the show. That's a shocking claim.
It's maybe the most cynical claim in all the source material. The sources argue that the degradation in visual quality.
What do they mean by that?
Specifically, the poor lighting, the flat visuals, the aggressively close camera angles. They argue these were conscious design choices.
For what purpose?
To make the content look better, or at least more readable, on a small 4-inch phone screen rather than a big high-definition television.
You're kidding. So the cinematic quality that defined the beginning of the series, the wide, atmospheric shots, the rich colors, that was all strategically sacrificed.
If the claims are true, then yes. If the visuals are less complex, less dynamically shot, they translate more clearly to a portable device. It suggests a business-driven strategy, prioritizing quick consumption over artistic integrity.
And the dedicated viewers definitely noticed. Many of them called the result childish and dull.
And here's the ultimate irony in all that. By making the show visually less engaging to optimize for the distracted viewer, they actually made the content boring for the dedicated viewer.
Which, in turn, makes people more likely to pick up their phones.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of creative failure.
That's a profound feedback loop. You dumb it down because you think we're distracted, but the simplified, sluggish result is what causes the distraction in the first place.
And this entire pacing crisis, all these lengthy talks before the battle, it all contributed directly to the ultimate, most profound failure of the finale. The anticlimax of the action itself.
Which brings us to our next section. The core mechanical failure of the show's conclusion, the final battle debacle. This is where that lack of planning and the obsession with exposition really crippled the story.
Yeah, the sources are completely unanimous on this point. The final battle was underwhelming, it was short, and it lacked any of the necessary tension you'd expect from a decade of buildup.
We found repeated claims across dozens of sources stating that certain emotional scenes, specifically Will's 7-minute coming out moment, were literally longer than the entire final fight with the main villain.
That ratio alone tells you there's a severe structural flaw. The audience was conditioned to expect an epic boss battle, a huge, world-shattering event.
And instead, what did we get? The fight was over so fast, it concluded rapidly and frankly pretty easily, leaving a full hour of runtime after the fight was over.
A full, anticlimactic hour filled with the exact kind of emotional expository cleanup the audience was already exhausted by.
It felt less like the climax of a war and more like a necessary skirmish before a long, sentimental, and ultimately consequence-free epilogue.
And that leads directly to what really drained the entire season of its stakes. What the sources call the plot armor problem.
Absolutely. The refusal to kill off any of the original main characters.
Mike, Dustin, Lucas, Nancy, Jonathan, Joyce, Hopper, Eleven, all of them. Untouchable. It just drained the narrative tension completely.
Critics argued this turned every victory into a predictable deus ex machina moment. Because deep down, everyone knew the core cast was safe no matter how dire it looked.
And this felt particularly bad because the previous season had been so aggressively branded as their Game of Thrones season.
Right. Which implies a dramatic increase in danger, a real potential for main characters to die. But nope, the core cast was made of Teflon.
The sources identified a very clear and kind of disheartening pattern. The only major characters who ever got sacrificed were the brand new main characters introduced each season.
You mean like Bob, Billy, and Eddie?
Exactly. Beloved, but ultimately secondary figures brought in to provide some emotional fodder and then get killed off to prove the stakes are real. But if you were a veteran character from season 1, you were completely safe.
And the audience figured this out. The moment a charismatic new character was introduced, viewers started taking bets on how and when they would die. The danger became a waste of time.
It really did. Why should I, as a viewer, invest emotionally in the peril if the outcome is preordained.
It's the emotional calculus of risk. You spend years caring about these people, and then in the final moments, the writers forget that tension requires true risk.
The profound irony is that viewers went from, I'm praying my favorite character doesn't die, to actively being, I'm mad they didn't die.
Because the lack of death undercut the drama that severely. It made the entire journey feel consequence-free.
And that lack of genuine risk then just compounds into the second major structural failure of the finale. The disappearing consequences of the huge governmental and military conflicts that had defined the show for years.
Oh, this creates so many plot holes. Massive ones that critics just couldn't ignore. We have major characters who should be facing severe legal repercussions, but everyone just magically resets to normal life in the final scenes.
Let's start with the big one, Hopper.
Right. How exactly did he get his sheriff's badge back? He didn't just escape from a Russian prison, a massive international incident in itself, but sources estimate he killed dozens of U.S. soldiers along the way.
And even if those soldiers were, part of some illegal black ops unit, the U.S. government simply would not and could not forgive and forget that level of violence against their own personnel.
It's the ultimate example of don't think about it too hard, but we are thinking about it hard.
And it's not just Hopper. The entire military apparatus that was running illegal experiments on children, Hunting 11, they just vanished.
Why did the military simply go away? Why didn't they detain or at least surveil the civilians who knew everything, who killed their personnel, and who had world-altering knowledge about the Upside Down?
A few sources tried to defend it, saying the military wouldn't want to publicize their own illegal experiments by prosecuting the kids.
Okay, but that only explains why they might drop criminal charges. It doesn't explain why they wouldn't perform extensive detaining, debriefing, or just maintain a permanent military presence around this town.
The knowledge held by these teenagers is a massive national security issue.
And the military just packed up and left. As one critic noted, it's like the military saw the hero save the world and just thought, well, they seem to have this handled, we're done here.
It's an egregious hand wave. It just ignores all the consequences from the 5 seasons before it. The show broke its own rules.
And speaking of breaking internal rules, let's talk about the monsters. The failure to use the established monsters in that final showdown was a huge critique. Where were all the Demogorgons, the Demobats, the Demodogs?
They spent years establishing this whole hierarchy and tenacity of these creatures. Then the final boss, the main villain, gets killed with a spear and some fire.
Critics immediately pointed out that those same weapons had previously barely even affected a standard Demogorgon.
So the power scaling just collapses. If a flamethrower and a pointy stick can take out the ultimate mastermind, why did it take a genius plan and a massive explosion to defeat a simpler one back in season 1? It makes the final threat feel inconsistent and just weak.
And the final nail in this coffin of internal reality was Max, her whole situation.
Max's recovery.
Yeah. She suffers these catastrophic near-fatal injuries. She's in an implied coma for anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Yet in the final scenes, she somehow managed to graduate high school right alongside her friends.
How? How does a person in a lengthy coma complete high school? Does the school in this town just operate on a time dilation field?
It completely trivializes the severity of her trauma, just to make sure we get a happy ending photo where all the original friends are together.
And if you connect this all back, all these plot holes, the disappearing military, the underpowered villain, Max's magical graduation, they all stem from the same root problem.
A fundamental lack of commitment to narrative consequence.
Exactly. They sacrificed logic for emotional convenience, and the audience saw right through it.
Okay, so moving from the plot mechanics to the emotional geography of the finale, we have to talk about the most polarizing character moment of the entire stuff. Will Byers' coming out scene.
This one sparked extreme division, mostly over its timing and its execution.
The primary critique, and we're back to this again, revolves around pacing and placement. The audience was in a final season, apocalypse is imminent mindset.
And right at that peak of tension, they insert a 7-minute, deeply introspective, highly charged emotional scene, confirming a secret everyone had already suspected for 2 seasons. It created this immense emotional dissonance.
It felt like hitting the emotional brakes right before the climactic jump. It prioritized character confirmation over narrative urgency.
Now, to be fair, there was a narrative defense for the timing.
Okay, let's hear it.
The justification, based on the show's own D&D lore, was that Will needed to confront his greatest fear, his truth about his identity, to remove Vecna's power over him.
Because Vecna is the god of secrets and lies, so revealing the truth strips him of his power.
Precisely. Revealing the truth, Will stripped Vecna of a key piece of emotional ammunition right before the showdown.
That rationale is intellectually sound. It's a perfect application of their own metaphors, but the consensus among many viewers was that the execution just felt clunky, almost mandatory.
Right. And while many celebrated the representation, a lot of others felt it reduced Will's complex years-long character arc down to a single, easily categorized identity marker.
And this leads directly to the critique of his final scene. His epilogue.
Yeah, his fate, shown in the final montage meeting someone in a gay bar, was heavily criticized. Sources noted it was a reductive, lazy stereotype.
Especially set against the backdrop of the mid-1980s, which was the absolute height of the devastating AIDS epidemic.
Right. Critics argued that setting felt simplistic and didn't reflect Will's complex personality beyond his sexuality. A much more nuanced ending would have focused on his primary passion.
His art.
His art. Imagine, instead of a generic bar scene, the finale shows him meeting a partner in an art school or at a gallery, something that reflects the creative personality they spent years developing.
They made art his primary coping mechanism and mode of expression, only to completely forget about it for his final defining scene.
And the ultimate confirmation of this creative neglect, it comes from the actor who played Will.
This part is unbelievable.
Sources revealed that the actor had to literally beg the writers to even include a concluding moment for Will's arc at all.
That is just so damning. It tells the audience that the final, most debated emotional beat of a major character's decade-long struggle wasn't carefully planned.
It suggests the scene, which felt rushed and shallow to so many, was just the bare minimum they granted him after he campaigned for it.
If your lead actor has to plead for a resolution, it proves a profound neglect for one of your main protagonists. It undermines everything.
And moving on to 11, her journey also failed to land for many viewers. Her arc was critiqued as ending in a narrative betrayal.
How so?
She was reduced to a metaphor of childhood hope, rather than a fully integrated, functional person who had earned her place in the world.
Her final choice to sacrifice herself, which turns out to be a fake death, of course, was criticized for leaving her fate ambiguous. It forces her into this perpetual exile, separated from her found family.
And that central relationship of the whole show between Mike and Eleven was left feeling unresolved and broken, despite their love being the emotional engine for 5 seasons.
This ending led to widespread accusations of spin-off dating.
That's exactly what it felt like. Viewers felt the writers kept her in this ambiguous, slightly broken state so that she could easily be forced into future spin-offs.
She had earned a normal, happy life with her family, but instead, they prioritized preserving her for future monetization.
The idea that she's just destined for perpetual exile, ready to be pulled back into the next crisis, it renders all her past victories meaningless. If the reward for saving the world is never getting to live a normal life with the people you love,
then what was the point? It's just nihilistic.
And speaking of details, we have to talk about the deep-cut critique that only the most dedicated Dungeons & Dragons fans really latched onto.
The sorcerer versus warlock debate.
This became a surprisingly technical flashpoint for the fantasy fans.
Okay, so for anyone listening who isn't deep into D&D lore, let's simplify this. Why did the show calling Will a sorcerer cause such a big rift?
So we need to look at the core differences. A warlock in D&D gets their power through a deal, a pact with a powerful external entity, a patron. The power is bestowed upon them.
And a sorcerer.
A sorcerer has inherent, innate magical power. It usually manifests spontaneously, maybe from a magical bloodline or because of some intense trauma. The magic comes from within.
Okay, so given that framework, Will's powers, his link to the Upside Down, his connection to Vecna, were clearly external. They were forced upon him.
Exactly. Critics argue that because Will's power was bestowed upon him by an external, malevolent patron Vecna, or the Mind Flayer, he was technically a warlock.
Not a sorcerer.
Right. He didn't have innate magic like Eleven. His abilities were a curse, a bond established by something else. This little inconsistency really irritated fans who appreciated how accurately the show had used D&D lore in the past.
But there was a defense for the show's choice, wasn't there? A technical one.
There was, though it's a bit weak. The argument is historical. The specific edition of D&D that would have been current in the show's 1987 setting
Didn't have the warlock class.
reportedly it was not formalized or widely available. So technically they could be sticking to period-accurate game mechanics even if it feels wrong to contemporary fans.
That's fascinating. It just shows the incredible level of scrutiny the writers were under. When the main plot fails, even minor terminology choices become a lightning rod for disappointment.
And that leads us to the structural failure that underlies all these issues. The deep-seated perception that the writers simply failed to plan the long-term arc of the show beyond season 1.
The most damning recurring critique here is what we've been calling the off-screen problem. Time and again, when viewers pointed out major plot holes or inconsistencies, the writer's solution, usually in an interview after the fact, was that frustrating phrase.
It happened off screen.
It became a proxy for lazy writing, an excuse for the lack of cohesion. The audience felt like the writers were scrambling to provide context after the show had already aired.
Let's use a crucial emotional example. The revelation that Hopper and Joyce went to high school with Henry, the future Vecna. That's a massive emotional connection for two of our main adult characters.
It was never shown.
Sources say that this crucial moment of recognition was only mentioned post-show as having happened off-screen. The audience was completely cheated of what should have been a powerful, integrated aha moment.
Why does that matter so much?
Because when key emotionally charged connections are relegated to a post-show interview, it feels like the writers are just making it up after the fact. It robs the audience of catharsis.
It fosters the belief that they didn't have a cohesive multi-season plan. If they had mapped out Vecna's past earlier, that realization would have been a powerful scene, not a footnote in an interview.
And this pattern leads us to the peak of this meta-creative outrage, what critics call the stage play barrier.
The single most important piece of backstory for the entire final season. Henry Vecna's origin, his time in high school, his interactions with young Joyce and Hopper, was relegated entirely to a non-streamable live stage play.
The First Shadow. An extraordinary choice for a global streaming show. Crucial required viewing canon material was locked behind a significant paywall and a huge geographical barrier. It only ran in New York and London.
So if you missed the play, you were fundamentally missing core context for the main villain's entire motivation. You didn't just miss a fun side story, you missed the origin story.
It sent a profoundly disrespectful message to the worldwide audience. If you want to fully understand the story you invested 10 years in, you should have flown overseas and paid hundreds of dollars for a theater ticket.
I mean, that's just a blatant example of monetizing essential plot information.
And it feeds directly into the cynicism arguments.
Ugh.
This rushed finale, coupled with the inaccessible backstory, led some to speculate that these failures weren't accidental.
That they were intentional.
We saw two major theories for this. The first is pure rumor, so we have to treat it as speculation. But it shows how desperate fans were for an answer.
What was it?
The theory that the show's quality dropped because a co-writer, rumored to be one of the showrunner's ex-wives, left the writing team mid-season 5.
While you can't prove it, you can see why fans would grasp onto that. It provides a tangible, if dramatic, reason for the sudden collapse in quality.
The second theory is far more cynical and speaks to the dark side of the streaming business model. It suggests that Netflix and the showrunners deliberately create underwhelming or frustrating finales, a technique known as rage bait.
Rage baiting your own dedicated audience. What is the goal there?
The goal isn't good storytelling, it's engagement. Frustrating, poorly executed endings drive massive, intense online conversation and criticism.
And negative attention is still attention.
Exactly. Negative traction online still translates to millions of hours spent discussing the plot holes, which ultimately attracts more curious viewers and critically drives eyeballs toward future spin-offs.
So under this deeply nihilistic view, the priority shifts from a satisfying conclusion to generating market traction through controversy. Quality is secondary to conversation.
And that ultimately is the tragedy here. The evidence confirms that when creators, whether through a mandate or cynicism, fail to respect the internal coherence of the world they build, not even monsters and psychic powers can sustain the narrative.
So we've seen a perfect storm here. The second screen syndrome mandate, a systemic lack of long-term planning, the off-screen and stage play problems, and just contentious minimum effort handling of character identity. All of it led a once-beloved show to a conclusion that many felt was deeply, fundamentally unsatisfying.
And the critical consensus is clear. Audience expectation for a satisfying ending has evolved. It now demands meaningful consequences, genuine risk, and absolute continuity. This puts modern final seasons under an incredibly difficult spotlight, especially compared to historical failures like Game of Thrones or Umbrella Academy.
When you invest a decade of your life, you expect more than just a happy, consequence-free reset button. You expect earned closure. The journey matters, but the ending defines the journey. And when the end feels cheap, it retroactively cheapens the time you spent. So, what does this all mean for the future? Here is the provocative thought we want to leave you with.
If the primary creative defense for a confusing, consequence-free finale is the assumption that you, the dedicated paying viewer, weren't paying close enough attention because you were distracted by your phone, what does that imply about the future of complex, long-form storytelling in the streaming age?
Are we just destined to consume media designed for the perpetually distracted, where narrative intelligence and risk are always sacrificed for maximum low-effort accessibility? It's a question that haunts every streaming binge. If the plot only holds together when you look away, maybe the writers need to be held accountable for the story they failed to tell.
Welcome to the debate. When an epic television series, one that has captivated millions for, nearly a decade, concludes with a final season budget hovering somewhere between $400 million and $480 million, the resulting reaction should reflect that. It should reflect a massive investment in flawless storytelling.
It should.
Instead, what we saw was just profound polarization, and for a lot of people, a deeply unsatisfactory conclusion. So the central question here, I think, is critical to understanding modern media narratives. Did the final season's shortcomings stem from these external market-driven creative compromises, mandated simplification and risk aversion, or were they just the inevitable consequences of unresolved internal plot complexity? I'm going to argue that these external compromises, which are rooted in commercial anxiety, were the primary factor that sabotaged this finale's potential.
See, I come at it from a different way. While I absolutely acknowledge that market forces created immense pressure and certainly resulted in compromises, I'm going to maintain that the structural integrity of the narrative was already compromised years earlier. The sheer, overwhelming, pre-existing internal complexity and the showrunner's failure to manage their own sprawling mythology, I think that guaranteed the failure to deliver a truly coherent or earned finale. The internal inconsistencies were, they were baked in long before the final season's commercial pressures took hold.
The primary and I think most damaging element was a deliberate, really noticeable shift toward what I would call creatively cowardly writing. And it was directly driven by external market demands. I mean, we have to address the reported existence of the second screen directive. This mandate, which was, born from the assumption that modern viewers are always distracted, checking their phones, scrolling social media, it necessitated this systematic dumbing down of the content. And this wasn't just about making plot simple. It fundamentally dictated how scenes were built. Complex information had to be repeated through clumsy, excessive exposition. Characters were constantly over-explaining plans or emotions that, honestly, attentive audiences could grasp visually.
Right. It's insulting.
It is. This repetition slowed the pace, it insulted the intelligence of dedicated viewers, and it just fundamentally cheapened the experience. And crucially, this commercial pressure dictated a severe risk aversion, and that resulted in the most egregious failure, the complete absence of stakes. The massive budget, ironically, led to high-value IP that became too precious to risk. We had this intense, apocalyptic final confrontation where not a single major original core character was allowed to die or even suffer a lasting consequence. The reliance on plot armor for the central group just transformed the whole high-stakes horror narrative into a low-stakes fantasy adventure. The final battle felt underwhelming because despite the spectacular visuals that $500 million gets you, we knew going in that there were no meaningful consequences.
That's a powerful indictment of modern creative management, I'll give you that. But I would argue that even perfect artistic freedom couldn't have salvaged a narrative that was already collapsing under its own weight. The narrative incoherence wasn't just manufactured externally in the final season. It was generated internally over 5 seasons of what feels like improvisation. The foundation was already crumbling because the show failed to respect its own established rules and its own sprawling internal logic. And that led to these glaring inconsistencies that just defy the show's established timeline and world.
Such as?
Well, okay, consider a fundamental plot point. Max, We are led to believe she's in a coma for what is referenced ambiguously as 6 months at least to like 2 years. Yet the show's timeline proceeds seamlessly to the end of the narrative, implying no major shifts for the others, and somehow she's still positioned to graduate. This timeline inconsistency is not caused by a commercial mandate. That is an internal structural failure where the emotional resonance of her trauma directly contradicts the basic chronology the writers had set up for Hawkins. And furthermore, the showrunners admitted they hadn't planned a cohesive ending, which necessitated the retroactive introduction, the reconning of the central villain, Vecna, as Henry. And, perhaps most damagingly, they outsourced crucial canonical lore, Henry's backstory, his high school connection to Joyce and Hopper, the full origin of his powers, to an external, commercially limited medium, a stage play. If the essential mythology you need to understand the antagonist's motivations is hidden off-screen in a theater production, that is the definition of a structural failure.
Okay, let's focus on this outsourcing issue, because I think it speaks directly to where the show's integrity fractured. The decision to place essential canonical explanations, the origin story of the main bad guy, and the deep connections he has with the core adult characters into a stage production that is not globally accessible it's fundamentally destructive to the narrative cohesion of the primary show. How can a dedicated global audience who invested years into this thing fully grasp the final antagonist's motivations if the canonical explanation requires a theater ticket in New York or London?
Exactly. It's homework.
It is. It fractured the storytelling, but I see why you frame that as evidence of panic and poor planning, but let me offer an alternative lens. While the outsourcing was, yes, undeniably a poor choice, a clear sign they realized they hadn't woven Henry and Vecna effectively enough into the past, the immense, glaring narrative holes in the final season felt dictated entirely by simplification mandates. The immense real-world geopolitical consequences of the characters' actions just vanished. These teenagers and their protectors, they engaged in activities that included killing federal soldiers. These are massive security consequences that should require complex, politically difficult story threads to resolve. Instead, characters who should be facing detention or, intense federal scrutiny are just free. Hopper is magically reinstated as sheriff, his prior history seemingly forgotten. This indicates a priority on a quick, neat closing that avoids complex consequence. The writers needed an easy exit, likely because resolving these real-world legal and military ramifications would require a geopolitical complexity that would violate that simplification mandate. It forces the audience to pay attention to stay in the loop, which runs counter to the commercial pressure to be instantly digestible. So the collapse of consequences is external pressure overriding internal logic.
That's a compelling argument about the quick exit, but isn't that simplification a symptom of the underlying mythological mess, rather than just a commercial dictate? If the internal world was coherent, the external cleanup would have had a defined structure. Look at the show's difficulty even handling its core metaphorical system. The writers demonstrated this clear confusion, even among the fandom, about whether Will Byers is conceptually a sorcerer or a warlock in Dungeons & Dragons terms.
Okay, unpack that.
All right, so in B&D, a sorcerer gets their power innately, often through a bloodline or, spontaneous magic. It's internal. A warlock, conversely, derives their power from a pact or a connection with an external, powerful patron. Now, given Will's fundamental and persistent connection to Vecna, the entity from the Upside Down, the narrative structure demands he be functionally a warlock. He draws his connection, his trauma, his foresight from that external patron. But the show often uses the term sorcerer. This lack of definitional precision, even in their central analogy, which serves as the very bedrock of their mythology, illustrates an internal failure to commit to or even understand the intellectual integrity of the lore they built. They were imprecise long before they had to simplify.
I agree that the lack of internal precision about their own chosen mythology is a damning critique. But I'm not convinced that conceptual sloppiness dictates the kind of commercially driven, jarring creative choices we saw in the final execution. The most jarring narrative decisions felt engineered specifically for maximum emotional impact or, frankly, manufactured controversy, regardless of narrative flow or pacing.
Okay.
arc regarding his identity. Placing that 7-minute, heavily introspective coming out scene in the middle of the world's final climactic countdown to apocalypse created profound emotional dissonance. It entirely paused the narrative momentum and removed any sense of urgency. When the world is ending in the next hour, a long, quiet discussion about personal identity, regardless of its importance, it feels misplaced. This timing seemed engineered to maximize impact or deliver a moment of high-profile representation that could be discussed and publicized, rather than serving as genuine character culmination within the immediate crisis. It felt like an item checked off a mandated list, especially given that the actor himself reportedly had to campaign heavily just to ensure the arc was addressed at all.
I agree entirely that the execution cheapened the arc. The external pressure to deliver a moment of representation was likely high, I'll grant you that. But the internal decision on how to deliver it was clumsy and reductive. The finale reduced Will's complex future almost entirely to his sexuality, culminating in a visual of him at what appeared to be a gay bar or club. This ignores his deeply established passion for art and storytelling, which has been central to his character and his means of processing trauma through the whole series. It felt reductive. It wasn't about celebrating his whole identity as an artist, a friend, a survivor, and a gay man. It was reducing him to a single stereotype to achieve shallow representation. This is a failure to write a complex human being, regardless of the commercial mandate for a specific type of scene.
That's a thoughtful and fair analysis of the reductive nature of character resolution. And unfortunately, this poor handling of development wasn't limited to Will. I mean, consider Eleven's arc, arguably the engine of the entire series. She was effectively reduced to a narrative sacrifice for a vague growing up theme. The conclusion of her journey resulted in an ambiguous exile and a future that feels completely conditional. This effectively invalidates the hard-earned relationships and growth she achieved with Mike and her found family. It prioritizes a vague thematic metaphor, the need to separate to grow, over earned character closure, leaving the audience with an unsatisfying sense of temporary joy.
And the problem here returns, again, to a fundamental structural failure, character blow and uneven focus. If we discuss Eleven's reduction or Will's sightlining, it's because the narrative engine became too big to effectively steer. There was significant screen time dedicated to introducing characters we hadn't previously invested in, like the new introduction of Holly, and spending substantial, sometimes repetitive time on Max's internal arc. Meanwhile, core, foundational characters we had followed for 10 years were just sidelined. Mike's screen time lessened dramatically, his personality vanished. He was just a sounding board. 11, despite her central role, too often functioned as a convenient deus ex machina. This imbalance is just undeniable evidence of a structural failure to plan or edit the structure effectively. You cannot manage 15 major threads in a climax. The failure to consolidate the cast proves the internal framework was flawed long before the commercial pressures of the final season hit.
I see why you point to character bloat as an internal structural failure. And I agree, the cast became unwieldy. But I maintain that the final result felt soulless and rushed and unplanned, precisely because the mandate to keep the material simple for distracted viewers dictated the structural failure. When the writers were forced to simplify, complex elements were rushed or hand-waved entirely. The best example of this is the catastrophic setup for the final battle. We saw the Upside-Down cracking into Hawkins, implying an apocalyptic swarm of creatures. Demogorgons, Demobats, all the complex monster dynamics they had established. Yet the actual monster confrontation was diminished and incredibly short. Why? Because integrating complex monster dynamics, showing how a Demogorgon functions alongside a Demobat swarm against Vecna's control, couldn't be easily explained or integrated without forcing the audience to pay attention to stay in the loop.
The need for a simplistic, easily digestible conclusion, a mandate from the commercial side, meant they had to sideline the complex monster lore they had previously established. That led directly to the structural failure of an underwhelming, poorly paced final confrontation. The commercial pressure forced the structural collapse. Ultimately, my position remains that deliberate creative choices aimed at commercial goals, specifically the simplification mandates from that second screen directive, the avoidance of stakes through plot armor, and the decision to engineer controversial yet reductive emotional beats, ultimately betrayed the story's inherent potential and sophistication. The massive budget, far from guaranteeing quality, imposed a crippling risk aversion that resulted in an ending that felt like a Cliff Note version rather than a fully earned, rigorous conclusion.
And I reiterate that the overwhelming narrative complexity, particularly the showrunner's attempt to retroactively weave Henry and Vecna into the entire history of Hawkins, resulted in unavoidable internal plot holes and conceptual inconsistencies that no final season could logically resolve regardless of external pressure. The fact that the story had to retreat into easily resolved, illogical outcomes, like the military forgetting about massive Black Ops activity and magically reinstating the sheriff, is compelling evidence of a broken internal logic that existed well before the external market pressures of the final season forced the writers to simply sweep it all under the rug.
This finale provides a unique and, I think, valuable case study on the pressures faced by creators attempting to balance their internal canon and complex narrative requirements against these massive external market demands, especially when a television show grows into a colossal financial property.
It leaves the essential question unresolved. Was the failure structurally inevitable due to overwhelming, mismanaged lore? Or was it compromised by commercial simplification? Despite the divisive ending, the depth of the material still sparks these essential conversations about the pressures faced when concluding long-running, globally popular sagas, urging us all to consider multiple perspectives on the art of storytelling itself.
If you enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell to the later update from my channel. Thank you for watching till the end, and see you in the next video.